Syria owing to the offensive launched by the rebel groups in the Middle Eastern nation. But today, the civil war in Syria has taken new shape, all because the Syrian president, Bashar Al-Assad, has reportedly left the country after the stunning advance by rebel groups on Syrian capital of Damascus. So yes, the Syrian rebels are celebrating the fall of Al-Assad regime on state television and on the streets, while the president's whereabouts remain unknown. The Syrian Prime Minister Al-Jalali has also broken his silence over a video address and says he's ready to support a transition of power and cooperate with the opposition now that the president has fled the country. But ladies and gentlemen, the final push to overthrow Bashar al-Assad has taken place in a little over 1 week. The main rebel group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or the HTS, is the one to have overthrown the Assad administration. Its operations were until now confined to the northwestern region that you see on your screens near the country's border. But on 3rd December, this rebel group took Aleppo after a surprise offensive on the city. Next, it pushed south and surrounded the city of Hama, and finally advanced to the key city of Homs on the 5th of this month. These three cities until then were controlled by the Syrian forces under President Assad. And in the latest offensive, the Syrian rebels have toppled the current government by seizing control of capital Damascus. The next big challenge, though, lies in establishing stability in the region. The one possible concern could be resurgence of Islamic State militants. Remember, Syria's civil war erupted in 2011 as an uprising against Assad's rule. It was then that several outside powers were dragged in, which also created space for extremist forces to fill the vacuum created. Now, going forward, the absence of a stable governance could once again pave way for these Islamist forces, and in a few cases may embolden them, because some of these rebel groups, like the HTS itself, have had their roots in Al-Qaeda in the past. So can they deliver on their promise of a more Syrian-centric governance devoid of any extremism? We talk about that, along with what this means for an already volatile Middle East. We'll also talk about the West and how it will approach the Syrian war given a regime change due in the next few months, especially with President-elect Trump calling for a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine in the wake of Assad's ouster. Before we quickly open that up, here's what's happened so far in the reactions that have come in.
Bashar al-Assad's regime's military defenses of the capital Damascus have melted away, are collapsing. Rebels have arrived from the north, the east and the south, getting into suburbs just right around the capital.
The course of the battle, as for the secrets of the battle, let's leave them to the unfolding events. You will witness them in reality, which is better than discussing them now.
And this today would extend from Gaza to Lebanon, now to Syria as well. But at the same time, we have to be realistic about competing interests in this region. So diplomacy is often easier said than done.
I want to quickly bring in our experts joining us this evening. We have Ashok Sajjan, our former diplomat, with us, along with Sushant Sareen, Senior Fellow ORF. We're also being joined by Glenn Carl, former CI officer from Boston, along with Raymond Wickere, Senior Associate, Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies from Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking out your time this evening. My first question is to Ashok Sajjanharji. Mr. Sajjanhar, while we're discussing what this may hold for India, for the West, so on and so forth, do you firmly believe what is being opined today, that the fact that, Al-Assad's key allies, Russia, Iran and Hezbollah, to an extent, have been either distracted or decimated by their own conflicts and are so over-engaged in that they perhaps allowed this to happen today? They allowed the rebel forces to move into Damascus?
Yeah, thank you very much, Christine. Yes, I think that is what would be the assessment because the spectacular, advances that HTS has made, and I would not say that they have allowed this to happen, but they were not in a position to disallow this to happen because they did try. Because, after all, as far as Russia is concerned, it has these two bases there. It has Latakia and Tartus, both the air base and the naval base. And that is the only exit that Russia has to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. So that is very critical. Having control over Syria is very critical for Russia. And they would not have allowed it to go unless they felt that they really could not do anything about it. And as far as Iran is concerned, also, it exposes them completely, this connection that they had from there, down Lebanon, from Syria, down Lebanon to Israel, meaning that connectivity is completely lost to them. So they also did try, but they were not really able to do anything about it. And that is why this has happened. And that is why I think when they had moved up to Homs, people were saying, analysts and commentators were saying, that they would not be able to move up to Damascus because Russia and Iran will not allow them to do so. But we have seen what has happened within a matter of days that they have been able to come and occupy Damascus. But of course, the future appears to be a big question mark. I'm sure you're going to discuss that also.
Okay, yes, we will indeed take that forward. Mr. Karl, what's your view on this? Because there are those who've come out to also say, and these are, of course, backers of President Assad, who are speaking against the United States, who are speaking against some of the Western nations who've also had some interest in the Syrian war. The allegation against the West, in particular the United States, is that this is the doing of both Israel and US, that they've essentially used Syria as a launchpad to take on Iran and Russia.
Well, I think certainly Iran and Russia are rivals of the U.S. and they've defined themselves as, I forget the term they use, but in any event, strategically that is correct. I think it's quite a stretch to say that what's happening now is a result of U.S. actions or string pulling. I really think the two critical dates with respect to what's happening today in Syria are February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and October 7, when Hamas launched its attack into Israel. The consequences have been that the Russian military has been bled significantly, and Hezbollah and Hamas have been decimated far more than most anybody anticipated when Israel began its response to the October 7 attack. And since Iran through Hezbollah, or Hezbollah through Iran, however you want to put that, and Russia are weaker, they have been unable, as the previous gentleman speaking said, to provide the same level of support to Assad. Thus, you have the destruction of the Assad regime. But none of that really is from the U.S.
Okay. Now that we're trying to, put in perspective the several reactions that have come in from all of these global players, what's also important is what happens going forward. Now, we do know that what's happened in Syria is a result of the, stunning offensive on part of the HTS. They've played a key role here. Mr. Raymond, I want to ask you this in that sense. How does West view this and the involvement of this particular group, so to speak, because it's a designated terror organization as per the United States? Not many believe that. In fact, HTS itself said that, it shed its extremist mindset, forces, affiliations in coming together of what HTS truly is known for today. But does the United States support that?
Well, thanks very much for having me. I think there's no question that this is an inflection point for India, the United States, indeed the world, in terms of what's happening in Western Asia, as you would call it. There's no question that the United States has been in an adversarial position with Russia and Iran. And connected to that, of course, are the relationships between Russia and China. and then North Korea. So those four nations basically, I think from the U.S. perspective, are coordinating, and as the speaker said, the invasion by Russia of Ukraine is a key time to look at. Now the question is, what are these two great democracies, India and the United States, going to do in order to follow their own values of democracy, rule of law and international relationships, human rights, and so forth? I think it's time for us to look at how India and the U.S. might work together on these. I think it's time for India to look at its relationships with Russia and Iran, particularly. There have been those, I think, in India who say, look, it really doesn't matter about what our values are with the United States and the West. We're going to do what's right for us. Well, what's right in terms of supporting and being in the same camp in terms of Russia and Iran doesn't look so good right now in terms of Middle East. And I think it's time for all sides to take a fresh look at how we can build peace and justice in the United States.
Okay, very interesting you say that, because I do know that Sushant Sareen would want to quickly come in on this and respond. Sushant, Raymond says that India's not picked between Israel, and when it comes to Russia, it's not picked between Ukraine and Russia. It's not made a choice between Israel and the United States. So what can we really expect going forward, given the manner in which we're seeing this kind of posturing being done? Because India's been questioned time and again on why not pick one side, and India continues to maintain we're not going to do that. We're going to look at what interests us best.
Look, number one, India is doing what every other country does. It's not as though the Americans, for example, take a position which is purely values-based. There are any number of examples where values have been consigned into the rubbish bin because the interests, strategic or otherwise, of the Americans or the Western alliances serve the purpose. So if India does it, it does not make us the bad guy, number one. Number two, for people in the West to pretend, and I am no defender of Bashar Al-Assad. Look, he was a dictator. He was a ruthless dictator. He was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. No questions about that. But sometimes the devil you know is a little better than the devil you don't. And it's not as though Bashar al-Assad has been replaced by the Syrian Mother Teresa, who's going to come and bring in progressive values and democracy and secularism and all those nice values that the West stands for. And it's very strange to see European leaders actually bat for the guys who have taken over, even though these same guys have run tanks over people. They've done all kinds of unspeakable crimes. And yet, for either the French president or some of the other leaders in the West, in the EU, for example, describe that this is a day of liberation, I think it's rather strange. The other thing which is extremely important, and I think people will miss that point, one is the remarkable resemblance with what happened in Afghanistan. The speed of the collapse, the fact that the Syrian army simply did not fight, it melted away. Okay, that was one factor. The second factor, which I think is extremely critical, is how much this kind of a victory by jihadist forces is going to embolden other jihadist forces, whether in Africa or in the Middle East, and which is why countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and many other countries will actually be seriously concerned about what the fallout of this particular development
but
is.
Sushant, don't you think that, the interest of, let's say, for instance, the United States right now doesn't lie in whether or not India will back the Assad regime? It actually lies in whether or not we will want to distance ourselves from Iran or, Russia, for that matter. That's what Mr. Raymond is trying to get to.
They can want whatever they want.
Yeah.
Look, they could want whatever, but we have to decide, because we have to live in this region. Okay. Again, we don't have to, we don't have to endorse, or we don't have to like everything the Iranians do. In fact, we don't. We don't have to, and we haven't. endorse the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But sometimes when you are engaged in a relationship with some of these countries, you hold your nose and you continue to do business. So, for example, for the longest, the Americans who lecture us or the Europeans who lecture us have not stopped dealing with Pakistan, even though it has a government which is virtually a military dictatorship, and an election has been stolen. Have you heard the State Department or the European Commission issue any diktats about that, or anything criticizing what has happened in Pakistan? Hundreds of people are killed. There are the kind of butchery that the Pakistan army is doing. Have you ever seen the State Department issue a statement about it, or pick up cudgels on behalf of human rights or civic rights in Pakistan? So it's very easy to tell us that don't deal with Iran. I don't have to like the Iranians.
Besides, it's just not limited to United States involvement or equation with Pakistan. Let's talk about Syria, for instance. It was the Obama administration, Raymond, that for the longest time supported opposition groups in their uprising against President Assad. So where is your contention coming from? It was only post 2014 when we saw the rise of Islamic forces that perhaps greater sense prevailed, and then we saw a little bit of a backward movement from the United States in Syria. Raymond.
Are you asking me?
No, I'm just posing that to Raymond. I'm just posing a counter question to him. Yes, Raymond, go ahead.
Well, it seems to me that it's not a question of listening to what the United States wants to have done. It's a question of what's in India's best interest and how does India see itself in the world. And if you look at what's happening in the Middle East now, and you look at what Russia has been doing, both in Syria and in Ukraine, it seems to me that in just pure old real politics, leave aside the question of values. I don't think you ought to leave aside the question of values. I think values are fundamental. It may be that we don't always live up to our values, but that doesn't mean they're jettisoned. But what really needs to happen now is India has to take a look at what its role is going to be. And it's not a question of just, we don't want to do what the United States tells us to do.
Okay.
That's fine. Don't do what the United States to do.
Okay.
Do in your own interest, and the interest that I would subscribe is not with Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea.
Okay, all right. I want to take that forward to Glenn Carl as well. Glenn, a very interesting comment came in from President-elect Donald Trump. Before we talk about what this means for India and whether or not there are any warning bells that we need to watch out for, speaking of the Trump administration going forward, do you expect the Trump administration to then ensure the withdrawal of the remaining troops in Syria? Because he says this is not our war to fight. He also, in fact, has once again made an appeal to President Putin to end the war. He's, urged or made an appeal for a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine once again. So how do you think or anticipate he's going to be taking this forward?
With respect to Syria specifically, well, to the extent that Donald Trump has any convictions, he is an isolationist. Beyond that, he sort of has visceral emotional responses and a transactional approach to any question in international relations, politics, or life. But he is an isolationist, and he does think that it makes no sense for American soldiers to die for anybody. So his reflexive desire would be to withdraw the U.S. forces. However, he's not completely detached from reality. And when American interests are challenged by or threatened by a theoretical potential surge in a safe haven or even a country for jihadists, then he will react violently, meaning that he probably would then keep American forces in place. It brings us to an important point from the previous discussions by my colleagues here. I think we need to make an important distinction uh, concerning Jolani and jihadism. It's true he was fought with Al-Qaeda or a branch or associate of it in Iraq against the Americans, but he has been pretty clear for 7 or 8 years in his efforts to move away from jihadism. There's a distinction between an Islamist and a jihadist. And it's also notable that the Americans, who have a $10 million bounty, or whatever one calls it, on his head, although the Americans have conducted a number of strikes in Idlib against jihadists, have not tried to kill him for years. And members of the State Department have said off the record, and I think even on the record, that the U.S. assesses that Jolani has substantially evolved. So there's a nuance that's quite important for the future, near-term future of what will happen in Syria with respect to U.S. policy in Jolani.
Okay, great point. Mr. Sajjanar, are you in agreement with what Glenn is saying? Because he seems to be saying that there are those in the United States who seem to have taken to what has been opined by HTS, because they've gone on to publicly declare that we've moved away from our extremist roots, you know, that we are now headed to a more pragmatic approach as far as governance is concerned. And that thought, Mr. Glenn is saying, is genuine. But for India, there are other signs that we need to watch out for. The fact that, you know, there have been terror affiliations of this particular outfit, given that it's backed by Pakistan, so on and so forth. How do we view that?
Yeah, you know, that's an excellent point that's been made, Christine. I think basically what we'll have to do is we'll have to see who is more acceptable to the people in Syria. Because, you know, first it was Bashar al-Assad, and, you know, all the commentaries that you might have heard, it said that there can be no one worse than Bashar al-Assad in terms of the terror and the oppression that he had, you know, imposed on the people of Syria. So they are welcoming anyone who would come in place of Bashar al-Assad. That's number one. Number two, coming to the point that Glenn Carl made, you know, he had divorced himself. He had broken all his affiliations with Al-Qaeda and with Al-Nusra Front, and he had also fought with them about 6-7 years ago. So I don't think you can paint both of them in the same brush. And ultimately what, you know, they have been, this group has been maybe not all completely successfully and peacefully. They have been ruling over the Idlib region. And I think we'll really have to wait and see. You can't pronounce you know, that he is going to be what, you know, you paint the same thing with as far as Al-Qaeda is concerned. Christine, if you permit me, I will just like to give a very small comment to what Mr. Raymond Vickery said about, you know, not being in the camp of Russia and Iran. So I want to mention that India does not want to be in that camp. India is in its own camp, and its own camp is one of peace. Its own camp is one of dialogue and diplomacy. And let me also mention that as far as interests are concerned, they are good, but values also hold great importance as far as India is concerned. And that is why you see today, as far as our bilateral ties are concerned, we have the best of relations with the United States. There might be sort of, you know, some areas where we do not, you know, there is a huge convergence. There might not be total congruence on all aspects, but there is a huge convergence on a variety of issues.
Oh yes, I think this sort of pressure from any of the Western nations is not something that India prioritizes at the moment. But let's get back to the question of the hour and closing remarks to you, Sushant. You know, what do you think is going to happen next? Like I said, the problem or the challenge really lies in how soon are we going to see stability in Syria? Because in the past as well, we've seen how there's been instability, and that's led to this vacuum that's been filled in by extremist forces, and that's the only concern here. So your last comments.
I'll make 3 or 4 quick points. First, look, people will celebrate the moment somebody wins because they want to be on the right side of the winner, right? We saw those celebrations even in Kabul, for example. And staying with Kabul, please remember that the, you know, I think just because somebody gives interviews to Western media outlets wearing designer, you know, Western suits does not suddenly make him a liberal and a progressive guy what he has always been. And just like the TTP and the Taliban said that we are only Afghanistan centric, we don't have any agenda beyond that. Similarly, the HTS has taken a similar position. But
Yeah.
I think what is important is we've heard similar things from the Taliban.
Yes.
Didn't the Taliban tell us that our attitude towards women has changed? Didn't the Taliban tell us that we have broken off all contact with Al Qaeda? There is no Al Qaeda in Afghanistan anymore. Do we not know that the Al Qaeda is very much present in Afghanistan today? Don't we not know of links between the Taliban and the Al Qaeda, even though they are below the radar? So, let's wait and see what
Yeah.
happens. But most importantly, yes, the HTS has won a significant victory, but that does not mean that they rule all over Syria. Syria is still a very, very divided land. It's still in the throes of a civil war, and just because the Assad regime became complacent and lost its foreign support,
Yes, but
and
Mr. Sareen, for now, that doesn't seem to
what's
be
going to happen now?
that doesn't
There
seem
could
to be
further
a
war going
concern
on.
in the near future, because so far HTS has come out to say that we're going to oblige by whatever people of Syria decide. So whether or not that's going to happen is something that we need to watch out for. Gentlemen, that's all the time we have. We need to shift our attention to a breaking news update coming in. Thank you so much for joining us with your insightful views. We need to now talk about another exclusive that we've managed to access. News coming in from Canada, where according to media reports, Liberal MP Chandra Arya is accusing his caucus colleague Sukh Dhaliwal of threatening him in the House of Commons. The incident allegedly took place after Dhaliwal, the MP for Surrey, tried to get unanimous support for a motion to condemn the 1984 anti-Sikh riots in India as a genocide. Chandra Arya, in fact, opposed the motion and claims Dhaliwal threatened him on his way out of the chamber. He also said another unnamed MP aggressively accosted him in the lobby. So once again, serious allegations being made by the MP Chandra Arya. I want to go across to my colleague Akanksha Swaroop to put the entire story in perspective for us. Yes, Akanksha.
First of all, between, as Dhaliwal has rightly pointed out, that as a member of parliament, he should be able to express his opinion and his views freely in the House, and that it is extremely concerning that members of parliament are being openly accosted. He's also said that an unnamed MP aggressively accosted him in the lobby. Moreover, as far as Sukh Dhaliwal is concerned, his threat coming over there for Chandra Arya is also indicative of how insecure Sukh Dhaliwal is. It's also the kind of role that he's playing as a rabble-rouser. It's not a first time. Also in 2010, he had tried to pass a similar kind of a motion where he wanted the 1984 riots to be branded as a genocide. Now, important to also highlight that Niger had always been supported by Sukh Dhaliwal, because at the time of the attack where Niger was staying in the Gurudwara, that is Sukh Dhaliwal's constituency of Surrey. At the same time, Sukh had been running a racket along with Niger. The intel sources have already shared with CNN News18. This was an immigration racket where people were brought from Punjab and were made to conduct illegal activities. So that also kind of explains why Sukh Dhaliwal is endorsed not just by Khalistanis over there, so by ISI, because in 2020 he had visited Lahore. His posters were plastered all over Lahore, and he was warmly welcomed by Pakistan.
Oh yes. So was it his backing for Niger that has prompted him to in fact treat Chandra Arya in that way? Remains to be seen. But many thanks, Akanksha, for joining us with that quick update. That's all the time we have. Thanks for watching. Good night.